Ready to launch into our next session. The first session we heard a lot about the hierarchy, food waste reduction, and yet even with the best reduction plans, we know there is still waste that will be happening there. And so session 2 is called Avoiding the Landfill, Food Waste Diversion Options for Communities. And our panelists are here today. I'll introduce the MC for this session, Angel Arroyo-Rodriguez. Angel is a Sustainable Materials Management Coordinator, an environmental planner in the Office of Compliance Assistance and Pollution Prevention at Ohio EPA, and also a PhD candidate right here at OSU in the Department of City and Regional Planning, specializing in planning for sustainable management of food waste and food waste diversion behaviors. So that I will hand it over to Angel to take over and lead our session. Angel?
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to be quick right now since I only need to introduce our next presenter, Susan. And she already has been introduced. I have the luck to work with Susan for the last 17 and a half years, as long as I've been with Ohio EPA. From the very beginning when I started in the composting program, she has provided me a lot of guidance, and I'm really happy that she's able to come back to Ohio in person and talk to us. Thanks. Welcome, Susan.
All right, hello again, everyone. Glad to be here. So I was, let's see, having the same problems Laura had. It must be like our EPA connection or something. Where am I supposed to point?
Maybe the projector.
Oh, okay. Well, the first picture that you'll see once we get it moving is the food recovery hierarchy. Will it work now? And so I was glad that Elise ended with the food recovery hierarchy. I start with it. It's sort of a bridging of our federal agencies. That's great. I really want to emphasize the point that Ashley made, that where we want to spend most of our time is at the top of the hierarchy, and that's source reduction. That's where we want to focus our attention on prevention, and that's, of course, what the last panel was really focused on. And as Brian mentioned, this panel will be moving down the hierarchy a little bit in terms of, well, what do you do with the food that is wasted? And you'll be hearing a lot more about those options. But this is really the foundation of EPA's Sustainable Food Management Program, is where we sort of try to focus our mind all the time, and again, try to stay at the top of that hierarchy, as well as helping with infrastructure development for the options near the bottom of the hierarchy. So, as you've heard, this is our goal. This is the trend we want to see. We want to cut our food waste in half by 2030. As Elise mentioned, this was announced last fall by USDA and EPA, and EPA is using our measurement of waste. As Ashley mentioned, that's where we have been focusing our effort in terms of trying to measure progress. So this meeting is all about what consumers and communities can do, and this is where the actions happen. And as a federal employee, it is sometimes challenging to figure out, well, what can we do at the federal level to try to help what actually has to happen at the community and the consumer level. So I'm going to do a really quick run through of some of the initiatives EPA has, some of the tools we've created that hopefully will help you and others implement some actions and help us to get to this national endpoint. So the first I'll start with is this call to action. So one of the, I think, most important roles that EPA and USDA and other federal agencies have is to participate in meetings like this, listen to what stakeholders are identifying as gaps and opportunities, learn about great practices that are going on around the country, convene stakeholder meetings. And so that's what EPA has been doing over the last couple of years, listening and gathering input. And so this call to action, I really invite you to take a look at this website because it holds a lot of information. It is organizing the recommendations for actions that we've heard, not just for the federal government, but for everybody to be looking at in terms of what kinds of actions we could all take. So, focusing on prevention, building the infrastructure, more education and outreach, better data and measurement, all the kinds of things that I'm sure you are all thinking about as well. It also provides specific information along the food chain, so for producers and manufacturers and retailers and consumers and those of us looking at policy and regulatory options. It identifies who are the stakeholders in those communities, what kinds of practices are already taking place out there, and what are the next steps that people have raised during meetings like this. So a good holder of this kind of information. Similarly, we've created this tool that's more focused on communities. This is, Ashley used the phrase of moving from a disposal mindset to a materials management mindset. And this is a tool for communities who are interested in that. It pulls together over 100 different strategies, policies, ordinances, programs, educational outreach at communities across the country. Organizes it in a way that you could do some searching and prioritizing depending on what your community wants to do. And then you can dig into, specifically what's the ordinance in this community, or what are the details related to this. This was put together collaboratively with several regions and our headquarters office. It's fairly new. Again, I invite you to take a look and dive in there. I looked at it recently just to refresh my own memory about what's in there. There was a gleaning example. I know Elise mentioned gleaning from some communities near New Jersey and Pennsylvania. There's an interesting example from Austin, Texas, of a not-for-profit who sends bicyclists out to restaurants to collect their food waste to take to their community gardening. So small examples like that, as well as much more larger, complicated food waste collection programs and large composting operations. So again, invite you to take a look, dive in there to see if there's some examples that would interest you. I think the other important role that EPA and really all federal agencies have is data and measurement and providing information that you can use to help plan, to help consider, to help evaluate your actions. So for my entire career at EPA, which is long, EPA has been producing this characterization of waste. If you have been in the waste world for more than 5 minutes, you've seen a pie chart like this, I am sure. And we have a lot of historical data, trends, in this kind of study that's come out every year. This is a pie chart about discards, what we actually put in the landfill or an incinerator, and you see that food is a big portion of that discard pie. This is the basis of that, the goal information on that slide. We're using this to track our progress towards the national goal. But I think everybody in the waste program at EPA will be the first to say this tool is not perfect. There's gaps, there's information that we need to find. And so over the last 5 years or so, we've been doing, I think, a much better job of improving the transparency of this study, getting the word out there about what the methodology is, what the data sources are, making the data available in a much more usable form for the many stakeholders that use this information, as well as taking a deeper dive into different parts of the study. So out of the 16 scoping studies that we've done in the last 5 years, 5 of them are on food. And these are, again, resources for you to take a look at in terms of what other data is available. It summarizes other studies. Sometimes there's trend data, sometimes there's snapshots, but we're trying to sort of gather in all the information that we can that helps us define what this problem is. So I invite you to take a look at that. The other partners that we're working closely with on data are our state regulatory agencies. State regulatory agencies collect a lot of information. Let me tell you, in all different ways, from all different kinds of stakeholders, it's very hard to compare or take a look at this. So we've been talking to the states saying, what would it be like if we created a platform for you to put your information in so that we have more apples to apples comparison, or that you can learn from each other and share the information. So this is just a snapshot of some information from Region 5 states on composting pounds per capita. You see that very tall bar in Ohio. As I mentioned, Ohio has been at the forefront for looking at management of food scraps and other organics for many, many years in our region. But last year we had 30 states participate. We hope that continues to grow. I think they're finding value in sharing that information. It helps to build their own capacity and understand what their neighboring states are doing and what the impacts of those programs are. So we hope that will continue to improve our measurement information. Okay, this is a little sneak preview. I'm so excited about this project. It's not done yet. It's a work in progress, but I think this will be a great tool for community level work. We hope to launch this at the end of this calendar year. Our colleagues out in the West Coast region, in Region 9, have really led the charge on this effort, as well as our Office of Research and Development, and our headquarters office is involved now. But this is a mapping tool that will have over 1 million establishments that generate food waste. So universities, hotels, other institutions, and an estimate of the food waste we think that they would generate. And we'll be publishing a methodology that describes how we're estimating that. At the same time, we'll also map anaerobic digesters that take food waste, composters, food banks, animal feeding operations. So that if you're in the community, no matter what your perspective is, you generate food waste and you want to know what you can do with it, or where you can donate food, or you are a composter and you're looking for who's generating food waste in my area, you'll be able to use this mapping tool to help you identify folks you can work with. So I'm really excited about this. It's our first foray into creating this. I'm sure we'll get feedback and we'll have to do some improvements as we go, but it should be a great tool. And my last highlight here, I'd be remiss, Elise mentioned our Food Recovery Challenge program. This has been the cornerstone of our sustainable food management program for the last few years. We're always excited to partner with organizations that are willing to set a goal, to implement some actions, to track and measure their results, and to allow us to shed a light on those examples. That's what that Food Recovery Challenge is all about, for us to highlight good practices and to help organizations sort of track their success. In Region 5, one of our outstanding participants is headquartered right here in Ohio, the Kroger Company. They have established significant donation programs across the country. I think their most recent reporting was 56 million pounds of fresh food donated. They also have some really interesting alliances with anaerobic digesters near some of their both retail stores as well as wholesale establishments. So we love working with them, and hope others will join us, because we'd love to amplify what's being done. The Food Stewards Pledge that's up there is focused on faith-based organizations. We see that those organizations as a great way to educate, to inform, as well as to recommend actions and motivate folks to make some changes. And of course, you've heard a lot about the Food Too Good to Waste program. So that is my very quick run-through of some EPA programs. I am here all day. I would love your feedback on these, as well as maybe suggestions for other things we should be considering in terms of what you all need to help us meet that goal. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Susan. We're gonna take questions for Susan later after Mike does his presentation. But before I introduce Mike, it actually is my turn to talk a little bit about what options we have in Ohio to manage food waste, or food that had already been determined to be food waste. And I reiterate what Susan said, the most important thing is to do prevention and do reduction. Even if we have ways to divert, establishing these processing facilities, this infrastructure, is not only costly, but it's also difficult for many other reasons. It's getting very difficult to site composting facilities. There's a lot of complaints in many areas with others, and people get bad perception about these facilities because they are considered solid waste disposals. When you hear solid waste disposal, you get people get freaked out versus hearing food waste recycling is very different. But in the state, in Ohio, we regulate composting and most of these facilities as solid waste disposal facilities that have a whole lot of repercussions to it. So talking about how we're gonna manage this, I'm gonna talk a little bit about existing facilities and potential options. And I kind of look at this into the kind of different technologies, and some of these technologies had also different levels of sophistication. Also, we have some pre-processing technologies that are very useful, then some reuse approaches, and a couple regulatory options. I'm not gonna be able to go into all detail because I only have 15 minutes. In terms of composting facilities in Ohio, if you're gonna take food waste, you have to take it to a Class 2 composting facility. There's an exception that I will talk about it later. Right now, this is fairly updated. And you see, don't look at the ones that had the deer. There's only by the Department of Transportation, they compost their carcasses that they collect from the roadways. But then when we look at the Class 2, we have to look at the ones that are commercially available for anyone to bring food waste, and the ones that are mostly established to handle their own material, like the Ohio University and a few others, the Finley Market. Doesn't not regulatorily, they could take food waste from anyone, we don't prohibit it, but that's not what they were designed for. So what a commercial composting facility look? This is kind of looking at composting windrows or elongated piles, most of the lowest technology, the cheapest kind of facility to build. But as you see, it can take a lot of space. To the top left is kind of a variation. It's still an elongated windrow, but it has two big walls on the side. We call that agitated bed. So it has a turner. You see a windrow turner here. This has something similar that just straddles the walls and keep moving it. Being a little less sophisticated or simple, we have an example of Finley Market where they use these in-vessel systems, they're plastic, they call earth tops. And those are can take about 3 cubic yards. They have about 3 of them in the market. They've been using them since 2010. With no problem at all. They collect all the organics, within cardboard, food waste. They put it through this. Notice here, this is an apartment building, how close it is. We have never had another complaint. I think Michelle from Cincinnati is here, and she has worked with a lot of them. Have you ever got any other complaints about this? It looks absolutely clean. The people that work there really manage it really well. And they don't see this as really anything too complicated. Ohio University down in Athens, they has this fancy in-vessel composter. I think this is the only one of this brand in the United States. They have another one of these, they had expanded. They take care of all the organics produced on campus through this. This machine works really well for them, but it's expensive, just this. Was about $250,000 to establish. So it can be expensive, but in some locations, it might be the best option. One of the most exciting systems is this composter, the Big Hannah composter, that is established by the Noble Correctional Institution. So that was the first application of it in the United States and was here in Ohio. Now we have 7 other prisons that are using this system. As you see, one of the amazing things is they were able to save so much money, and this was the initial estimate, when actually they end up saving about $85,000 a year on food, on waste fees. The good thing about this machine is that you can adjust it. You can just have it to put the material and just have like for a week, so you have the quick decomposition, you get the heat, the pathogen kill, and then you take the immature compost outside and you finish curing it. Or you can adjust it so it goes through the whole process, so you actually have cured compost at the end. And this is located in the basement of the prison, so you don't need that much space, so it works really well. The one thing that I want to make you aware is an exemption that we added in the rules in 2012, and that's what I alluded earlier. If you are composting, you have your materials, the composting stays in an area of no larger than 300 square feet, you don't have to register or get a license with Ohio EPA. So that makes it, the reason we added this is to allow a lot of people to start getting experience managing this waste. Also, we had many situations like Youngstown State University had those earth tubs in the back of the dining room. Only one earth tub, it takes about 100 square feet. So 300 square feet will give you enough space to store bulking agents and your curing compost, not having to have them registered. And honestly, an earth tub like that, it was more of a burden on inspectors to have to go once a quarter to just look at it and say, yeah, it looks great. And I traveled 3 hours for this. So it's very good. It wasn't a good use. The same thing with the ones at the prisons. Some of them are just edging at the 300 square feet, and we need to figure out a way to make it easier, because going to inspect this at a basement of a prison takes a lot of clearance and a lot of time. But this is a good option. A lot of schools, community gardens take advantage of this, and this is the great thing about this. This was an initiative of the Community Gardens organization that helped us come up with this. In terms of anaerobic digesters, one thing that is, I find really cool from Ohio is, well, we have very little, only like 4 anaerobic digesters at CAFOs, at confined animal feeding operations. While you look at California, they have hundreds. However, we have the largest number of anaerobic digesters that are not associated with a farm or with a wastewater treatment plant, which is great. And you see these are all the locations. We also, and one great thing is, last year, I tried to check of all the permits of wastewater treatment plants, which ones had anaerobic digestion and which ones were not capturing the biogas. And there's great potential about having about 60 other anaerobic facilities of these digesters that we could potentially upgrade so they can take food scraps and that they can then capture that gas and clean it. It's gonna take a little bit of money, but it's possible as they come along and do all their improvements. If you've been south of Ohio, these are, you see, south of Columbus, you see the quasar. There's about 8 or 10 of those around the state. This was the very first kind of quasar one in the wastewater treatment plant. This is at the cheese factory. They're actually using this to treat their wastewater. And this is a poultry farm that converted a composting facility to an anaerobic digester. They're taking some industrial food waste. One that is really exciting here in Ohio is actually bokashi. Who has heard about that? 1, 2, 3, great. So what is bokashi? It's defined as acidic anaerobic fermentation. So it's anaerobic, but it's not done by the bacteria or the methanogens that produce methane, like in the regular anaerobic digestion. This is done by lactic acid bacteria, photosynthetic bacteria, and yeast. So it's almost like pickling, this material. So at this facility, this is in Marietta, Ohio. I don't know, Jim was supposed to be here today. I was hoping he would show up, but we have Ray Leard here that he will talk later about this. The material, they actually put it through a shredder and add the inoculum and seal in these drums for 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, this kind of looks like. You look at the material, it still looks almost the same. However, there has been a lot of pre-treatment, a lot of degradation going on in the structure. So you could take this material and put it directly on soil. That's what it was developed in Japan in the 1960s. An easy way for farmers to take their food scraps, treat them, and then till them into the soil where they will be quickly composted or decomposed by microbes. However, doesn't look that marketable like that, so more places are now trying to also then do further composting or feed it to worms to do vermiculture. And as you see, the pH is very low, so that takes care of the pathogen concerns on food waste. So this is a very promising way to manage a lot of food waste in a very quickly manner with very low odors, because this only smells a little bit like sweet pickle juice. And honestly, I literally have to put my face in there about an inch from this waste to be able to smell it. Vermiculture is still a potential solution. You know, this one takes a little bit more sophistication, taking more care of it. In terms of Ohio EPA, we don't see this necessarily as a solid waste disposal. We see it as livestock raising. If you're gonna you have worms or you have pigs, you will go and get food waste to feed your pigs. You're taking food waste to feed your worms. That's what you are doing. Unless you were combining it with actual composting at pre-step, then we will include it. But we consider this an additive step, not actual composting. Another cool one is black soldier flies. Who has heard of this? See a lot more. Cool. I haven't visited it, but it's a brewery in Yellow Springs, Ohio, I believe, that is taking all their waste, using this system to divert it, and then feeding chickens with the maggots. So I took this picture, this is very rudimentary, but it shows the concept. You have the larvae here that you would hardly see a fly, but you see all the larvae. I mean, they're really growing there. But they kind of self-regulate the population size, and once they start overpopulating, they will migrate through this tube and then fall into this bucket. And then from the bucket, you can use it to either feed tilapia or feed chickens. And there's many, you look online, there's a lot of fancy setups for these of any sizes that you can imagine. Rendering, this is another option that is becoming popular. And as you see, these are the number of renderers that we have now in the state of Ohio. 15 years ago, they disappeared. We went down to one. We all think of the renderers that, when you take the dead farm animal to the rendering or all the rot kill, they smell, they stink. This is a very different kind of approach. These are marketing themselves as recycling. They don't go after all the nasty stuff. They go after the clean stuff to produce high products. Well, so a lot of them take a lot of fats, oils, and greases. A lot of the meats, fats, oils, and greases from Kroger, Walmart, and any other places here in Ohio is now going to rendering instead of composting facilities. Pre-processing technologies, the packaging is becoming very important. There's a lot of recalls, so there's a lot of off-spec products that now these companies that have all these sustainability goals don't want to throw in a landfill. So they're looking for options, and this was the packaging facility we have in Ohio that was connected to an anaerobic digester, but we have now one in Northern Ohio that is a part of the composting facility, a class 2, and another one is part of an animal feed manufacturer. So there's a lot of opportunities for that. Here at the Ohio State, the Blackwell Hotel has a system. They used to just call it the food scrap for composting. Now they put it to this food processor. The one that you have at home is like 1.4 horsepower. This is about 10. So you can put even bones and seafood shells in here. Then this makes it into a slurry and is stored in this tank. Once the tank gets full enough, it sends a signal that it needs to be empty. A tanker truck comes, empties it, and takes it to an anaerobic digester. So we have the Shuttle State Center also has it. The Cleveland Indians Progressive Field also has that. The Browns, I believe, and there's several ones coming up. And at the Ohio Union, they also have a pulper and dehydrator. And this one initially was a little bit different. It was going for composting, and this was set up that the material comes out as a flake, pretty much think of mashed potato flakes, kind of like that, but it's still not, it still needs to be processed, and from there can go to composting or anaerobic digestion. And I just recently went to the University of Cincinnati that they have installed this kind of take on this process, and the material comes out. The difference of this pulper and dehydrator is that this one will also heat it up. It will process it for a period of time, and it comes out looking as pellets. That with no other reduces about, you can see here, from 2,000 pounds that they started day. After all this process, they're down to 80 pounds. So it really makes a big dent when you're gonna look how you're gonna manage this afterwards, how you're gonna transport it, how you're gonna store it. Reuse options, animal feed. There's the direct feed option. You probably want to call the Ohio pork producers or the poultry producer or the poultry council and ask them to help you find a farm that might have a use for your food waste. Feed manufacturing is also something that is becoming more important, and these are the ones we have. For some reason, they're all Northern Ohio. And we have a panelist later that's going to talk more about this. And that's all that I have. Now, very quickly, since I probably took more time than I needed to. Right on time? Okay. So I'm going to use Mike Long. I also have known Mike as Long has been working at Ohio EPA, and he's not only been a great colleague, a great mentor, but we do a lot of projects together. He's one of our go-to persons when we need to figure out how to do something or learn about something. So Mike is the president of Resource 100, a consulting firm with a focus on waste reduction, recycling, and the conversion of waste to products, fuels, and energy. He's currently focusing on projects related to food scrap recovery and conversion. He's a frequent speaker on issues relating to food scrap recovery and serves as the co-project manager for the development and operation of the Ohio's Grocers Foundation Food Scrap Recovery Network. He's also served as a consultant for the Ohio Byproduct Synergy Network, and he's a member of the Ohio State University team that developed this workshop and webinar. Let's welcome Mike.
Thank you, Aniel. I'll take that. Let's make sure it works first. Okay, good. Well, first, let me take the oath that I am a subscriber to the hierarchy and the need to reduce waste at the source first. But I live primarily on step 3 and 4, kind of in the sub-basement. I used to live in the dungeon down at the landfill, so I've improved over time, I hope. So what you're doing, whether you know it or not, is really hard work, trying to reduce the waste at the source and try to manage it so it doesn't end up in a landfill. Now, 150 years ago, these folks didn't have the problem that we have today with trying to be efficient and build what we call route density. You're going to hear me talk a little bit more about that, about the need to have a very dense route, but that wasn't the case back in New York City 150 years ago. Now, if this wasn't so hard, we certainly would have solved it long ago. But think about this. When you go to your grocery store, you can bet that whatever grocery store you go to, somebody's going to pick up the garbage, but they're not going to pick up the food scraps necessarily. And so that leads us to that problem about route density. I would argue that if we look and take from the field of industrial ecology, and for those of you who are not familiar with that term, and for the students in the room, I would urge you to Google it and do a little research on it. It's a very important concept of managing flows of pollution, money through our ecosystems. And if you think about it, we could take the waste that's in the world. Now, whether it's just food waste or other kinds of waste, wasted heat, wasted energy, wasted water. You could apply this concept to any kind of waste and turn it into food, and in this case, literally or figuratively, the food being the nutrition, the feedstock, the raw materials necessary to drive our country and provide value by, the value would be by employing people, retaining employment, and you can increase profits, reduce operating costs, and generally improve our country and the globe by applying the principles of industrial ecology. Now, here's 10 reasons why it's really hard, and I'm not going to read these, and you know most of these. We could take every one of these issues and spend a day seminar just exploring each of these barriers to food waste recovery. What's interesting is it happens all along our supply chain, starting with the collection. In the waste industry, we use this rule of thumb that about 50 to 70% of the cost of managing these materials are in the collection side of it. The disposal, the ultimate disposal, is really a small part of the total cost. So what we end up with is a logistics problem, or a series of logistics problems that we need to solve. Now, we talk about the food supply chain, how we get it from farm to market. But there's a collateral food waste supply chain that goes around with it. Every one of those entities that touches our food is creating some kind of waste. And I think what we don't do is think about it as a system or an opportunity to harvest all of those wastes. We look at everything independently and perhaps try to optimize that. But if we start thinking in a more system and a more connected way about the food waste network, we might end up with some different solutions. So what we need is, and we have available, economic models that will look on the far left at the generators, the different kinds of generators, the different kinds of food scraps that they create. They're not all the same. We have different kinds of collectors and collection systems. We have different processing technologies, and Anya just gave a very thorough review of those technologies. And if you pay money, you can make all of those things, and that's not an exhaustive list on the right, but there's a lot of commodities that you can turn that wasted food into. So we have the ability, and we should explore in detail and put more data behind an economic model that lets us make better decisions. You need to get really detailed and really focus on this. I call it the 5 phases of food scrap collection. The first beginning right at the house or the business, and when you put it in the can or the container. Now, you need to think about processor issues, and here's a big mistake a lot of people make. They say, I want to recover my food scraps, and here's how I'm going to do it, and here's what I'm going to put it in. Here's the kind of bag I'm going to use. I'm going to buy a biodegradable bag. But they never think about what happens at the end of the line, at the processor. So I say the first thing you need to do is go hug your composter, or get to know what's going to happen to your stuff, and that'll help you make a better decision and design a better system all through the supply chain. There is at the bottom of this slide, the hidden cost of food scrap diversion. I've seen so many of these systems fail, and attempts to do the diversion fail because it just costs too much. And one thing that keeps coming back is the need to train, retrain, and retrain people to do it right. Because the minute you mess up and throw the wrong thing in the food waste bin, you can bet it's coming right back at you. And they're going to send a signal from that processor back to you that says, you can't do it that way. And eventually you'll throw your hands up in the air. So it's really important to understand what happens once it leaves your business or home. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. The next thing, obviously, is the truck. And there's lots of kinds of trucks that you can buy and collectors have in order to get this stuff to the location that you've decided. How does it move from house to house? That's another thing, and this has to do with the route density. If you're designing a community system and you don't have very many participants, or it's a voluntary system, you're going to have increased unit costs and maybe not much participation. So you need to think about, again, route density and how that truck is moving through the network. You also need to understand, like, how many pickups a day can I do, that collector, and what parts of the city are they going to be operating on. Whoops. When you get to that, there's models based on the type of collection equipment you have, whether you have compactors, self-contained compactors, other types of containers without compaction. There's a whole variety of ways that stuff can move from your house or your business to the ultimate processor. And everything has a price tag attached with it depending on how the system is designed. There's simulation software available to do these kind of things. And again, I urge those who are designing systems or thinking about systems to understand where all of the costs are along the line. Finally, once that truck has made a decision, it's going to go somewhere and discharge the material. Where is it going to go? If you look at an aerial view of an area, you know, you may have, it could go to a landfill, it could go to a compost facility, it could go to an anaerobic digester. Every one of those has associated with it a fee to discharge the material and a cost to get to it. Now here's an interesting example. I call this a 3-wood and a wedge. This is an example of a compost facility that was located literally across the street from a transfer station. And the tipping fee at the transfer station was $50 a ton, and the tipping fee at the compost was $20 a ton. The reason this transfer station had to move the waste another 30 or 40 miles after someone tipped it at their facility to get it into the landfill and pay all the associated fees. So in this case, there is a direct savings of $30 a ton if you went to the compost facility. So I scratched my head and said, I just wonder why anybody in the area that had the kind of food scraps that was eligible to go into that compost wouldn't take it there, because the collection costs are about the same. The containment's about the same. So they would be driven economically to go there. So what I would recommend is a strategy that we think about as planners and regulators, that when we're siting facilities, why don't we take into account the proximity to other solid waste facilities? It's an excellent idea to first look at a transfer station and try to go right across the street, or go right across the street from the landfill. Co-locate those facilities, and you'll get a huge economic advantage when you're designing your system. I'm not going to go into this in any detail at all. Anya's done a fine job of that already. And we're going to have an in-depth discussion of some of these technologies in the afternoon session. It's a busy slide on the left. I just want you to see, when you pay your garbage bill, you pay for a lot of things you may not know about, including, you know, you got to rent the equipment, you got to get it collected, you got to get it transferred, you got to pay a disposal fee, and then you're going to pay some taxes and local fees. The one thing, generally speaking, at least in Ohio, and I don't know about other states, but generally speaking, you can avoid a whole bunch of fees and taxes if you take it to a compost facility or recycling facility than a disposal facility. So there's a built-in economic advantage of making that choice. So the model that we now have, I'm going to reverse that model I showed you earlier. I would argue by fine-tuning the system, by paying attention to detail, by understanding the complete supply chain and becoming an expert, whether you're at the beginning of the supply chain or you're a processor at the end, I would argue that over time, you're going to be able to put a downward pressure on cost and start driving that backwards so that there will be a lower cost to the consumer, and therefore there will be more diversion. That's my theory. What we're looking at here then is the possibility of moving towards a circular economy, which I think is very important when it comes to this. It's not just about end-of-life processing. It's turning that stuff into something that is then used by another company, another business, to then generate more value for our community and have economic value and create more jobs. This is just one little example of how we could take food scraps from different generators shown on the left, but look at all the things we could get from it. We can get fertilizer, we can get compost, we can get energy, we could even turn that methane into pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals and all kinds of other things. It's all about the money, the cost, but the one thing we got to do is optimize the system to make sure that supply chain is reliable and clean. The one thing that's going to stop your program, no matter what you're doing, is to get contamination, and that starts at the generator. And that's the hassle factor that I talked about that's so detrimental to these systems. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Well, at this time, we're gonna take questions for any of the panelists. Have one over there. Hi, Beth.
Hi, I'm Beth Lozier, and this question is our comment question to Mike and any other panel presenters. I tend to believe that both are important, the beginning and the end, also materials management versus collection. And so one of the thoughts on that was, if the end person, if you're going to the end of the waste stream and you're educating, and I agree, the training is critical to do it right for the purpose of whatever you're going to recycle or create whatever energy or CNG or whatever you're going to use the end product for. But when you're reaching out to 650 or 2 routes of 1,300 residents, and you're training them and you're educating them from the beginning, you're reaching the individual through groups of people in a route and the density that you need. And they are the ones, 2 family incomes, who are working in the manufacturing area and own the companies, and they will take it back and be part of, I believe, the materials management side of it. So my question is, I'm going to be specific, Mike, to you in terms of the end product container. If you were to use a 32-gallon container, and you were going to allow the residents to put compost in the bottom to keep it less messy, so when the hauler comes, whatever hauler that is, and dumps it out, you know, because odor and cleanliness, and you don't want them to use bags, and there might be certain type of food waste that you can or cannot put in it, depending on what type of energy you're going to go after or composting facility. So as we educate, do we want to gear toward a certain market that you're going to be taking it to? And can you put compost materials in with the food waste to be a win-win situation for the resident, the hauler, and then the energy producer?
Let me try. That was to me, correct? Yeah. Okay. I think my presentation was directed at the non-residential mostly, because in Ohio, we don't see enough of that yet, of residential food scrap diversion. But it's coming. And again, there's where we need to figure it out, but it's coming. So that presentation works better and easier when you're talking about a business, a grocery store, someone like that doing it. Okay, so now to answer your question, as I understand it, you got to look at what you want to do with it ultimately, because the end conversion, the end processing, if it's going to a compost, that's going to be a lot more difficult than if it's going to something that can literally transform, pyrolysis or gasification, that would transform it, recover the energy, and you could live with the contamination. So I feel so strongly about this issue of contamination and how it can come up with the works and how it can just increase cost and spiral out of control, that I think you got to really choose that technology first and for the community, because it's hard to do some of this stuff on small scale that deals with contamination. Does that help?
Yeah. And I do think that your residents in some of the other communities are the ones who are running the materials management side of the packaging in the industry. Right? So if you educate them by individual, by group, you're going to accomplish both.
I want to add a little bit to that. Certainly, if you're going to establish a residential program, you need to look into what kind of facilities you're going to use for processing. It's very different if you're going to go to anaerobic digestion or you're going to traditional composting. And even if you're going to anaerobic digestion, you need to look into what kind of digester you have. If you're taking it to one like the ones we have right now in Ohio that are low solids, more kind of liquid, slurry kind of waste, those usually will only want materials with high energy. That means that they might not want you to put any paper, any yard waste on it, because there's very little energy to extract from that. And they will have to shred it first and process it a little bit. It's not the same thing to shred fruits than shred branches from a tree, right? So they're gonna have to have a different kind of equipment. If you're going to a high solids digester, that's basically you could put all the food waste with yard waste, anything like that, put it in a kind of garage type of place, and then you will take it out and compost it. That's a little bit more tolerable. If you're going for composting, again, that determines not only what kind of materials you can combine, but what kind of equipment and containers you can use. We have like in the Toronto area, they only want to take all the food waste separately from yard waste. So they use containers that are more leak-proof. They can be completely sealed, locked in. We have this city of Huron here in Ohio, where they take it to a composting site, and they allow people to put it with the same craft paper bags, yard waste bags that you can buy at the supermarket. They put their yard waste and they add their food scraps there. And that has been worked since 2010 without no problems at all. Just because where is it going, the distance is not that far. So, and actually when you add this food waste with the yard waste, a lot of this vegetative food waste quickly loses the moisture, quickly disappears. Several years ago, Laura and I had the opportunity to tour the facility in Minnesota that were doing the same thing. They were opening bags that have food waste that you could hardly see anything. It has just, by the time it's collected and taken, the food waste starts to kind of compost with the yard waste. So there's a lot of considerations if you're gonna have a residential collection program.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? We have Susan over here. Hi, Susan.
So I'm interested in the conversations that any of you may be having with some of the suppliers that you had listed sort of on the left side in terms of grocery stores, restaurants, and in looking at that circular economy. If it becomes so cheap for them to dispose of it as food waste scraps, right? Citing the example you set it next to the landfill, you have whether it's an anaerobic digester or whatever model you want to pick. How does that begin to influence and what kinds of conversations are happening with those entities around using that disposal method versus repurposing? Because at the end of the day, I'm interested in how we all economically make it work for everybody. So if we look at the hierarchy and we're putting feeding people and feeding animals above composting and landfilling, how does that begin to impact somebody like Kroger or someone who has a huge amount of food? What's their incentive in the long run for donation and feeding people versus just going, you know what, it costs me $20 a ton to go take this, to the anaerobic digester versus I have to sort and staff time and haul. How does that all fit together? Do you have any insight or thoughts about that? Anybody?
I can start, but then hand off. I think for many companies like Kroger or other companies, they have internal sustainability goals, and they've set corporate-wide targets that they work hard to meet. So I know in some instances, that drives them pretty hard to try to find alternatives to disposal. If they've set zero waste goals by a certain year, they want and need to meet that. And so the struggle they have is finding the system they can tap into versus looking too much at the differential in cost. So I think that's one set of corporate areas. I think in others where they might be smaller, they might be struggling, have a much narrower range of which they can accommodate a cost differential. I think particularly in the Midwest where our disposal fees are very low, it is always a challenge to sort of make that work. And I think what Mike was really hitting on, this circular economy, is the broader way to look at costs that you can make that argument, where you can start looking more broadly at joining in with other companies to see how you could help create a feedstock for them and, make more connections. And I think the byproduct synergy network that Mike is involved with is a way for companies who may not have the ability to take on a differential in cost to look for other ways of making that system work. So I don't know if Mike has comments on that.
I can add that I think it starts with planning at the local level and through the solid waste in Ohio, through solid waste districts and the EPA. And it should not be done just piecemeal. It needs to be more integrated and holistic so that we don't create some stranded investments and make some mistakes along the way. If you take my simple economic model, which needs to be more detailed and includes source reduction as a strategy, I think you'll find that's the cheapest thing you can do, is to not create the waste in the first place and not have to handle it. So I think if you look at all the options and put them apples to apples, I think that'll drive you to the right decision for your community. They don't compete necessarily. They should be complementary, and you do what you can, the best you can with what you have in front of you.
Can I have a little follow-up? And so if you're doing source reduction at the beginning, so you have less, doesn't that then impact, let's say we have this effort, it's really successful. My question is, how does that then impact the reuses that we've tried to do? So if we're viewing this in part as a way to feed people who are hungry, if above that we end up reducing, do you know where I'm going with this? If you reduce so much,
Right.
then there's how much is left to then repurpose to refeed. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, go look at your landfill, and you'll see how hard this is, and this is a really long-term thing that's going to occur. You got to plan. You got to look and say, I'm going to reduce by a certain percent by a certain year, and what am I going to reduce? Because then you can make some pretty good estimates of what your feedstock is going to be if you're going to build a plant, a compost facility, a digester. So everything needs to be integrated. You try to reduce what you can, but as said earlier this morning, it's inevitable. We're going to continue to have lots of this waste, unfortunately. And so as long as your planning horizon is out there and it's consistent with the reality of what's being generated, you should be able to make good decisions. Because I think I understand what you're saying is as you reduce and have less, the unit cost, if you will, goes up, and you end up with a spiral down thing. I mean, that's the argument against landfills that try to flow control stuff into a landfill to make the economics work for them. The same could be true of a digester, an anaerobic a composter that needs a certain amount of material to make it economic.
Also, I think we need to consider that when we talk about reduction, there's reduction at various levels. It's not the same thing to reduce food waste at your home than reduce food waste at an industrial facility or recovering by gleaning food on a farm that otherwise will be wasted. That is still reduction, but it's different than recovering and reduction. So we need to make a little bit of a distinction, because we do want to make people make better use of it, but then there's other material, other food that is still wasted that shouldn't have, and sometimes doesn't even go to the consumer directly. Any more questions? Any questions online? No one? Who's hungry? Oh, yes, sorry. So before we eat, sorry for those of you who are hungry, Mike is gonna do a quick introduction for what we're gonna be doing this afternoon. Thank you.
Okay. In the afternoon session, I think it's session 2, I think. Breakout 2. We're going to have a complimentary session that'll follow what we just been through, digging deeper into some of these ideas, these technologies. One is coming from Ray Lurd at the Compost Exchange. This is what Ray is going to be discussing this afternoon. He has a very unique grassroots effort to provide food waste reduction, including strong doses of education and interest on source reduction. The next slide that I have control of actually shows, and you'll learn in detail how Ray's program works at the grassroots level, and he wants to expand that program into more of Central Ohio. Whoops. Is there, do I have to pull up another? Whoa. Sorry about that. We're also, okay. So Anya mentioned this, that in Northwest Ohio, there are some farms that are taking food scraps and producing animal feed, and you're going to hear from Sustainable Solutions, a family-owned business, and what they're doing. What's unique about them, in addition to taking food scraps and turning it into feed for their hogs, they also have a large deep packaging facility and warehouse, so they're able to take this material that heretofore may end up in a landfill and figure out a way to recycle the material, the packaging, and end up with food for their hogs. So you're going to hear take a deeper dive into that, and then I got to load up one last one. We're going to We're going to hear from Dr. Susan Mueller and David Andre about their lean solution for diverting waste from the landfill. DNO is a produce operator here in Columbus area, and they're going to be talking about their sustainability efforts and how they're collaborating on this with other businesses, and the EPA grant program, which has helped them as a startup put in some technology to further reduce the waste coming from DNO and others. And then David Andre will again take you through the barriers and the problems that they encountered and how they solved those problems to get a project up and off the ground. So we'll have a more in-depth discussion of that. So those 3 presentations will occur in breakout session number 2, and we invite you to that.
Yeah, so incredible set of assets we have here and intellectually on the stage here to help us think about our own programs. This afternoon, we'll be diving into programs, breakout sessions. The complimentary session is actually on your agenda, breakout session number 1. It'll be held here in this room in the auditorium, Overcoming Barriers to Implementing Food Waste Diversion Programs, Ohio Examples, and we've seen the teaser slides here for those will be part of that session. Looking forward to that. Brandy Whetstone of MORPC will be here to lead that group, and we're looking forward to the exchanges in there. The other session for Breakout 1 is going to be how to begin baseline food waste data collection with households and neighborhoods. We'll bring back Laura Moreno and Peter Check and tap into their deep experience in running these types of programs. Just a quick show of hands, how many do you think will go to the Mike session with kind of the deeper dive on the food waste diversion ones? Do we have an idea? Okay. And then how many of you for the other session on collection, data collection? Okay, that session will be across in room 110 by the, kind of the front door where you walked in this morning. And there'll be some presentation portion of that, but again, that's where we want the rubber to hit the road, and we encourage people to bring their own ideas and questions to that, and we can kind of dig deeper. After that, we'll have another break and poster session, and then we'll get into even a smaller group sessions of what we're calling our flipped sessions. In here, Mike Long is going to lead a breakout session where we're kind of identifying the opportunities and overcoming barriers for your own food waste programs. Session 1 in here will be focused for folks from solid waste districts and municipalities or other similar types of enterprises. Tony Gillen from OSU Energy and Sustainability will be right across the hall in room 150 for people interested in educational and related institutions and policies and programs therein. And then back across the way in room 110, community groups and related organizations. We're very lucky to have Christy Cook from Sodexo here to lead that group. And in these groups, it's really going to be about engaging you, getting you to talk about what's going on in your organization or your aspirations for your organization, so that we can get you ideas about what your next barrier is, how the assets and ideas here might be purpose for that. And then if there are issues or things where OSU and the Food Waste Collaborative can help maybe with some ideas, resources, support, we'll also be in there listening for your ideas on that. We'll then come out after that 2:40 breakout session. It's only going to be an hour. We'll regroup in here, summarize for the day, point to where our evaluation is going to be, and then we'll send you on your way. So